Welcome everyone to the internal research seminar series and today's seminar. Today we will hear more about work in the Behaviour and Choice Initiative, and it will be presented by Fiona, Marie and Ylva. And as usual, we'll take questions afterwards. So for those who have questions here, we'll have to use the mic so people online can hear. And please, if you're online, write your questions in the chat to Ian. Perfect. I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so it's a team effort today. We've got quite a few slides to get through. We'll try and leave plenty of room for a discussion at the end. So basically today we're going to talk about service design, which is an approach and a method that we've been using in the Behaviour and Choice Initiative over the past couple of years. You might have heard us talking about it or presenting bits of it here and there, but we thought it was useful to present all of it in a sort of more thought-through, packaged way as we're getting towards the end of the second phase of the initiative. But basically it's useful to recap a little bit, I think, on what we said we would do in the Behaviour and Choice Initiative from the beginning, both in terms of the research objective, but also the policy objective. So for the research objective, we were looking for ways to identify key factors that influence behaviour in the context of technology adoption at the household level in low-income countries. And why are we doing this? This policy objective was to increase the effectiveness of interventions and products introduced in these contexts that could better respond to behavioural influences. And now we thought it was nice to sort of say, like, based on everything we've done, where we are now, we think the focus is on translating the behaviours that we're identifying, the needs and experiences of people who are at the centre of a change process into robust, implementable interventions. That's what we hope, where we hope we are right now. In a way, you could say we've developed a policy diagnostic toolkit, and we feel that if it's implemented at all phases of the process of designing interventions, it could enhance the overall effectiveness of the interventions. It could be very useful. And what we've been doing is testing elements of this toolkit in a series of case studies that started back in 2015 and are continuing today, looking at everything from household energy to uptake of agricultural technologies, uptake of mini-grids, the design of weather index insurance for smallholder farmers. And it's good to see, sort of reflect a little bit on the starting point of the initiative, what we thought we'd be doing and why we ended up working with service design, you could say. So in the beginning, we were looking at behavioural economics and health psychology as the sort of cornerstone of our work, or the obvious starting point. There was quite a lot of literature on this. For people who aren't so familiar, behavioural insights has emerged in a really big way as a sort of inductive approach to policy making that's combines insights from psychology, cognitive science, social science, and then with empirically tested results to try to understand how humans actually behave and make choices. And we're seeing this more and more, especially in this part of the world, but a bit more in development interventions as well. But early on in the initiative, we realized that this approach alone is insufficient to meet the objectives of the Behaviour and Choice Initiative. And that's because what we're dealing with in many of our case studies are so-called wicked problems. And maybe it's worth defining what a wicked problem is. It's a problem that's difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements that are often difficult to recognize. And importantly, wicked problems, if you manage to solve one part of them in one place, you could end up causing another problem somewhere else in the system or having an unintended sort of consequence. So these complex adaptive systems where we work are full of wicked problems. So whether it's adopting a clean cookstove or a farming technology, the behaviours that we're focusing on, they're not one-off actions carried out by an individual, by one person at one point in time. Rather, they can involve many people within a household, within a community, within a whole value chain. And even if we can identify behavioural drivers and really pinpoint what's going on with a person in a system, it's really hard to understand what the relative importance of a behavioural driver is in a certain context, and how that importance changes over time and for different people, different archetypes in the system. So we found early on that we needed another approach to help us get at this.
So this other approach then is something called service design, which we now for, almost 4 years have worked consistently with, both in collaboration with service design professionals and also on our own, as another way of sort of tackling these wicked problems. What is it about service design then that's so appropriate for our needs? Well, firstly, service design is a human-centered, qualitative and iterative approach, which is used to develop systems and services that are useful and meaningful and make sense to the person acting within the system. So the user is in focus. But because it's an approach, it's not only an approach, it's also a tool, and it comes with a set of tools that I will talk about briefly in a minute. The fact that service design is iterative means that it starts very, very broad and then moves along a process to sort of gradually narrow the scope. This very wide inclusion, or this very broad starting point, means that it's very appropriate for studying, for instance, problems where you have multiple actors involved on multiple levels influencing change. And this is also then captured at the very start, and then as you go along the chain, you understand more about which levels or which actors are more relevant to the problem being studied, and that allows you to sort of zoom in. The third thing is that it's heavily relies on co-creation and working actively with a broad range of participants or stakeholders. And it goes through these 4 different stages, which I won't go into detail now, but just to say that co-creation and active sort of user participation is involved at every stage. It's also very collaborative in that it often involves many different researchers or many different service designers working together to solve the same problem. It's increasingly being used in the public sector as a way to enhance service delivery to public sector clients. So for instance, Försäkringskassan here in Sweden has worked heavily with service designers over the year in order to make their website and their apps more user-friendly. So those of us that apply for compensation for VAB, for instance, for staying home with 6 children, we can do this digitally tele now with an app, as opposed to handing in a form to Dagis and get them to approve it. And those insights were all generated by service designers. So you're increasingly in many countries, but I think mostly in higher income settings, seeing sort of public policy labs emerging, where the public sector agencies are working with their users to understand how they can improve services. So we're building on that and leaning on that approach. What is it then that we've taken from service design that we've found particularly useful? Well, I think the main thing is really is a sort of a set of experience-based maps as a way to understanding the problem we're studying. And the type of mapping that we've most frequently used to date is something that we've called user journey mapping, which is basically a way of conceptualizing a change process in a phased approach. So something happens, but before that something happens, there's a before phase. And then something happens, and then it goes on. So it's basically to say that a change in behavior is not a one-off event, but it involves many different changes, and they all relate to each other. What this journey, or what this user journey mapping approach has allowed us to do, is to really falsify the assumption that all journeys look the same, so that all behavior change embarkations, they don't all start at the same point or end at the same point, but rather you can have a journey where someone, for instance, hears about a new mobile phone, but then never buys it because it's too expensive. You can have a journey where someone hears about a new mobile phone, starts using it, but then discovers that, no, this really isn't working for me, and then discards it. Or you can have a person that sticks with this phone all the way until the battery runs out, and then replaces it because the product, in this case, has died or stopped working. So I think by understanding that different user journeys look different to different people, we can also then understand at what point in the change process different types of people need active support in order to get through the whole journey. So that's basically what we've done. And we'll get back to this with using 3 different case studies in a moment. Very quickly to say that service design involves a lot of user interactions, and it involves a lot of sort of in situ interviews. So this is in the homes of people that have purchased improved cookstoves in Lusaka in Zambia. Interviews often last up to sort of 3 hours. They involve a lot of observations, a lot of talking and drawing pictures. We use trigger material as a way to sort of entice and open up conversation. And trigger material can be anything from sort of pre-prepared pictures to just sketches generated in between interview settings. We found that trigger material is often a very useful way to ask the same questions many times. And it can also be a way to sort of challenge an answer. So this was in response to talking to someone who had purchased an improved cookstove, who kept telling us that, yeah, I love the stove, it's great, everything about it is perfect. But we very strongly sensed that something wasn't quite right. So then we sketched up this picture, which clearly showed different types of stoves in terms of height, in terms of width, in terms of fuel. And with this picture in mind, it was much easier to get into a deeper and more rich conversation about things that could be changed for this for the stove to work better for them. I've talked about iterations being an important element of service design. So this is just to say that instead of, when we go on a field study, if we say that we have 10 days of work and we do 3 interviews every day, what happens is that at the end of each day we meet to do initial analysis of what has happened during that day. And based on the outcome of that analysis, we pursue sort of new lines of inquiry. Are these questions working? Are there other things we should be asking? Are there more questions we should include, or other questions we should exclude? We also explore whether there are sort of new formats for interaction. So is this trigger material working, or should we be using other pictures? We also, as you see here, worked with, these are examples of service designers or professional service designers that we worked with, which for us was quite a new type of professional collaboration, in the sense that we worked with professionals within a field that weren't necessarily researchers but working for a consultancy. It could merit a whole separate seminar. Many opportunities, but also many challenges, because we came from very different backgrounds. But we've all agreed that it was a great way for us to get started. I think and this is the last sort of important tool that we've taken from service design, is that we do, at the end of a sort of a field trip, we always do immediate co-creation via participatory workshops, which means that at the end of a field trip, we present initial findings to a set of stakeholders, and ideally also users or interviewees, so people we've been speaking with, which is a great way to sort of ground truth and verify very early findings with them. So not to come back and present sort of near final results, but really to invite them into the process and challenge our findings, if you so will. And I think it's a nice way to sort of indicate very active ownership on part of the interviewees or the users. So that's it in terms of what we've taken from service design. I will now move into the second part of the presentation, where we'll give 3 examples of how we've used service design in 3 different settings. And so the first example comes from 2 studies on the uptake of cleaner cookstoves in Lusaka in Zambia and in Kiambu outside Nairobi in Kenya, where the focus of both studies was really to understand how drivers of individual behavior influence the uptake of cleaner cookstoves. The main thing that we used service design for here is that we took this notion of a user journey, so essentially a phased approach to a change process, and combined that with a set of behavior change techniques commonly used in the cookstove sector. And that allowed us to see at what point in this change journey the user needed help in order to stay on the journey as opposed to fall off. So the red dots are like key things that happen in the adoption process. And all the blue dots illustrate things that can go wrong. So you find out about a stove, you want to buy it, but it's not available. User falls off. You get to here, you learn how to use the stove, but then the stove malfunctions. So you can't figure out how to use it and you get bored trying. So then you stop. Without getting into too much detail, basically this combination of the user journey on the one hand and these behavior change techniques allowed us to see at what point in the user journey a company, for instance, selling stoves can come in with active support towards the user to get them to stay on their change journey. And this then, for instance, has implications for program or project funding, because it tells you that you shouldn't be spending all your promotional money here, but really you should also be investing in support mechanisms to help the users get the technology to work for them. The other thing that we did in this cookstove work was that we started to identify behavioral groups or archetypes of behavior, to say that there isn't one type of cook, but really there are different types of people where you can sort of trace patterns of behavior at different points in this change journey. And this was then a notion that carried through to other case studies, which Ylva will talk more about now.
Since this is maybe also. All right. So I presented this in the science form, so I'm not going to go into a lot of details. So I'll just quickly run through this example. But we looked at how technologies or uptake of technologies to reduce pre-harvest and post-harvest losses in mango value chain in Kenya could be improved. And because we used a very broad scope, we quickly identified that there's a multitude of actors and they're all interlinked in this system. So basically we expected to follow a farmer's user journey or experience-based journey, and we quickly realized that just following the farmer through the mango value chain does not give us the whole picture of what's going on in the system, because there were a multitude of scenarios of how the farmers behaved in the mango value chain, and technologies were introduced for reducing harvest and post-harvest losses to farmers, but the common farmer in this case was not involved in harvesting of mangoes at all. But actually there were brokers or middlemen that came to the farm with their own harvesters and purchased the mangoes from the farmer directly, which meant that the technologies that were introduced by the Yield-wise initiative, they were introduced to the wrong user. Exactly. Sorry.
Yeah. So we're going to Uganda now. Staying with farmers, but moving away from technology. And this study is one that we've just started. We've done the first round of field work. We haven't fully analysed or written up our results, but it's useful to present it in terms of how service design was used and what we think it's giving us in this context. So the main problem we're looking at here is eastern Uganda, unpredictable rainfall because of climate change, drought recurring every year, people being hit by pests, all of this becoming more frequent, and an idea from a local stakeholder that insurance, and more specifically weather index insurance, could be very useful for these smallholder farmers, but a lot of uncertainty about how such an insurance product should be designed, what it should look like, how it should be rolled out, and so on. So we were invited by a partner at the University of East Anglia, their Department of Development Economics. They are looking at behaviours around risk-taking and risk response in relation to these problems. They had an idea that they would do some behavioural experiments to investigate further what these insurance products could look like, but that they weren't getting the full picture at the local level in terms of the wider context. So we we thought maybe service design would be a good thing to bring in here to do the first step. So we went there for about 10 days and we did about 40 of these interactions, so these long interviews with households. We also did in-field workshops, so like focus groups. And we did one of these ecosystem stakeholder workshops at the end where we quickly brought our results back to key stakeholders in the community and asked them to sort of help us complete the picture if there was anything that was missing. So the first step on all of this was to map out the annual cycle, the main crops grown. And we realized quickly this was a very, very complicated system. There were at least 4 crops on average being grown by each farmer with different cropping cycles, each with their own sort of problems. We had a very complicated sort of annual cycle when we overlaid all of these crops one on top of the other. And then we had various opportunities for potential intervention to come in and support farmers when things were getting difficult. But it was very complex. We thought in the first couple of days, we're never going to get our heads around this. We eventually then presented what we thought was this composite annual cycle for all of these different crops and different kinds of farmers. We presented in a workshop and invited people to help us change it, correct it, tear it apart if it wasn't making sense. Parts of it made sense, parts of it didn't, and we managed to get, we think, a more complete picture, so that was very useful. Another thing we used, or we found from this, taking this approach, was that there are many different ways, this is obvious to a lot of people in the room, but there's many different ways that people respond to risk and shock. It's not just in terms of finance and where you're going to get a loan from and who can help you out with financial support if a disaster happens. Our partner at UEA, these development economists, had done a little bit of preliminary work, but most of what they'd looked at was to do with finance and savings groups and where people go for support. What we managed to do was to widen this a little bit, and we identified 11 actions or behaviours that people take in response to risk. Some of them were to do with finance, but many of them were to do with social institutions that they were members of, social networks that they made use of when things got difficult. And these risk responses hadn't really been articulated in the previous work that was done. So we think that's hopefully a contribution. And then related to these different behaviours, they're not all being done by all farmers. All farmers are not the same. So we managed to come up with, or we think, identify 3 more or less different archetypes. One who we named Andrew, Betty and Charles, or A, B and C, but we needed names and sort of personas to present in the workshop. So Andrew has strong shock capacity in all of these different ways, both in financially but also social institutions and social networks. Betty, on the other hand, has weak shock capacity, and then Charles is somewhere in the middle. We used our workshop to paint these archetypes for the respondents to see, is this making sense? Do you identify with these people? And we had them play a sort of game where they mapped out risk responses for each of these characters. And we had them do that several times in groups. And then we compared that with what we were finding in our interview data to see that there was actually a lot of overlap between the risk responses we were seeing. It seemed to sort of verify what we had been finding. So that's pretty much what we did in the qualitative stage. And we're going together with UEA to design a behavioural experiment, which will be a lot more quantitative. And the idea is that we take things that we think we're seeing here to do with these archetypes and how people seem to respond to risk, and we will test them in a sort of standard behavioural experiment to see if they hold up and to see, are these really parameters that we can use to build a potential insurance product around? If they are, we're hoping to build an insurance product around them and then test that later on in the year. And now,
looking at the literature of behavioral economics, this is basically how a cycle of design, implementation and adoption of interventions look like. And there is ongoing discussions about how this is much too linear and that there should be more interaction between the different steps. And we quickly added the 2 steps that's obviously missing, redesign and upscale of interventions, which is applicable in almost any intervention where you would have an attempt to try to upscale and redesign. And we've now done a couple of case studies, and they enter this kind of cycle in different stages. So for example, the cookstoves one, that comes already at the kind of identifying the problem, whilst the mango case study talks about how technologies or interventions can be improved. And the Uganda case study comes even before this whole cycle even begins. But we believe that using these kind of methods from service design, user journey mapping and co-creation of systems maps would be useful in each step of an intervention, design, implementation and adoption cycle, and that they are all small iterative cycles, and that this kind of cycle would benefit from.
Yep, but when we're selling it to our potential funders and donors and partners that we're working with, we often highlight that it's modular. So no matter where you are in your design process, you can improve it by using this approach or this method. All of it or just parts of it. That's important, I think. So then just very quickly, hopefully this will sort of move us into the discussion part, but pros and cons of taking a service design approach. Based on our own experience, as demonstrated, we think it's answering the key questions of the Behaviour and Choice Initiative, so that's nice. Then it's extremely efficient, an efficient way of quickly understanding a complex system. I never thought I'd get my head around these farming cycles in Uganda, and I still don't think I fully have, but I think because of this method, I'm halfway there at least. In just a few days, we managed to get quite far, and to situate the user as well as other key actors in the system. And we think it has the potential to support transformational change because it brings in so many actors. It brings in the people who actually are in a position to make the change happen early enough in the process so that it can be scaled, hopefully. On the sort of negative side, service design isn't really applied very much in this context. It's not very well described in the literature, so we struggle a bit when it comes to publishing papers on this, and we spend a lot of time defending what we've been doing and trying to explain it. And it depends very much on intuition. So these in-field rounds of analysis that we were talking about earlier, it's a bit hard again to describe those and to show that it's to show where these assumptions came from and how they changed, and to carefully document that. So it works very well for service designers. They never have to show this. They're working for private sector partners. As long as the product or the service at the end is improved and helps them sell more stuff, then they're really happy. But for us, that's not enough. We need to show really carefully how we got to all of these assumptions. Yeah. I think that was our last slide. So thanks, and please ask us questions.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Let's open up. I have a question, but we can take more from the audience first. Yes, Biljana, you have to talk in this.
I can ask one very quick question. You mentioned some challenges of this, but you also mentioned the challenges that you had with working with service designers and the way how they were thinking about this. And you coming from the research side, you probably had a little bit different ideas. So I was wondering whether you can explain a little bit more about those challenges and like clash of worldviews.
Yeah, definitely.
Should I start then? I think one of the challenges really spoke to sort of which parts of this delimitation process that you have to document. So I think we're quite used to sort of having an interview guide and then asking the same set of questions to X number of people, and that in itself, there's a robustness element to that. But when you're every day almost changing your interview guide and dismissing questions and even adding new ones, the process of documenting the interview process becomes extremely onerous and at times very overwhelming. So in working with service designers, we not only had to justify why we were doing it, but also became sort of quite alone in ensuring that that was done in a rigorous enough manner. So I think that's one bit. I think another one was just sort of what constitutes a reliable finding? Like how many times do you have to hear something before you can consider it a pattern? So just because 3 out of 15 people say something, that doesn't mean that it's the truth. But is it sort of close enough to the truth to sort of pursue it as one of your new lines of inquiry? Well, maybe. So it was constantly this sort of trade-off. So what is a sort of, I mean, one theme is really what is a sort of robust enough insight for us to say that we want to take it and run with it.
Yeah. I think so too. Do I need this?
Do you want? Yeah.
And the documentation of that decision. Like I struggled with that. Maybe you find a very clear pattern, and so they're very eager to then move along. And to me,
They being the service designers.
And to me also, it's very interesting to how to document up to that decision, or what made you make that decision. And to them, that's baggage. I mean, why would you just carry baggage? So that was a personal challenge. I had to try to explain that body of baggage is super important, because that sort of makes a decision.
I think it was a balancing act all the time in all of the cases that we've done. Like not like squeeze the creativity out of this. Like the beauty, the magic of service design is this like creative moment of trying something. You don't really know, but like let's just try and see. Allowing that to happen, but carefully documenting it and being able to justify along the way, why each decision was made, I think.
Can I just ask a question in relation to that? Do you consider this type of project and these types of methods much more that they take much longer time than previous research that you've done before? Does anyone want to say?
I think in the beginning they took a lot more time, but we've done it now so many times that we've developed, I think this toolkit that I talked about, it really does feel like something we can take off the shelf and quickly do. It does require a lot of, especially if we move into a context that we've not worked in before. When we do cookstove so many times in Kenya, you can sort of take a lot of things for granted. But like insurance in Uganda took a bit more prep. But in terms of the steps of the service design, like knowing what each step will more or less look like, we've streamlined it, I think.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Greg?
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for making me part of this really exciting project for the last 4 years on and off. Since I have not really worked with you for the last 2 months or so, I would like to know, how much response have you gotten from this type of approach from SEDA or from the private sector? Knowing that, I mean, service design, if you talk to, I don't know, my fancy works in this kind of area, but not for development issues, but for product development issues. So it's a very established field of doing product design and the marketing. But have you gotten any response to say, okay, this looks really great from our sector? And then the other question is, we talked about this a little bit now, standardization. Has this process helped you to identify KPIs? So basically something that is a bit more measurable if you want to scale up.
Who wants to start?
I can do the first part. Okay. Yeah, we talked to SEDA about it as one example. A few different partners, but SEDA springs to mind because I had a lot of meetings the most I've ever had with SEDA, I think, in such a short space of time last autumn, and got to talk about this quite a bit. And I noticed that as soon as we mentioned design or design thinking, people got quite excited. So there's people want to know more about it and what it is, and I get the sense there's a bit of a buzzword in the development world. And we tried to make the distinction between product design and service design, that this is a different branch of design thinking, maybe. But yes, it's been really well received, and I think it feels like now is really the time for us to do something with it, because I've heard recently that SEDA has been approached by a service design consultancy not so long ago to do some sort of internal organizational work with them. And that's something we want to do. That's what, so for us, the next step in this would be, okay, lots of little case studies are really good, but if you could get a partner on board who could really internalize this method, this approach, and do all of the steps in a really sort of coordinated way together with us, that would be amazing. So I think there's a lot of potential and a lot of interest. Yeah.
And I mean, we also received very, very excellent feedback from Rockefeller Foundation on the work we did in Kenya. Do you want to say something about that, Ylva?
Well, we presented it for their Yield-Wise conference, and I think it was very well received. It's been very, very well received from the start, from the Rockefeller, because I think we highlighted very relevant results for them. And also when we presented it, we were approached by a number of other value chain leaders that basically said that this is what they need, or that the problems that they encounter, this is kind of the answer to that, because it's not, there is a lot of great technologies, they're introduced, but they're not adopted, and they can't really show why. So it's, yeah.
And just to add quickly, I mean, we haven't talked enough about stoves, so let's do a bit more stove talk here. But just going back to our work in Kenya, and also I think especially in Zambia, where we worked closely with 2 companies that were actually producing and selling their own cookstoves. Based on our field work there, we were able to give them very specific recommendations on how to update their user manuals, how to change the way they approach their customers, how to sort of tweak the portioning of pellets into the stoves, and things that they did and sort of quickly fed back into their business model. So there we were really able to help them improve their sales figures. But on the second question on sort of indicators for upscaling, I mean, the brief answer is no. But I think with going back to the Uganda work, where we will now be adding a quantitative component to test our qualitative insights, I think that work could sort of be a springboard for going in that direction. So we're thinking about it, but we're not quite there yet.
I think first we have a question online, so we'll take that first, because it was, and then you guys. So go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, this is a question from Karti at SEI Asia, and he asks, how do you perceive service design is going to help in knowing farmers' willingness to pay for the index insurance?
It's a very specific question.
Okay, I guess I'll.
I mean, I think it's a very useful method to identify. I think we used it in, for example, in other cookstove cases. I mean, that's, I think it's translatable to agricultural cases, where you can identify behaviors connected to willingness to pay.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that's one of the things we'll look at in the behavioural experiment in Uganda, actually. Once we have the sort of key parameters of what an insurance product could look like for these various archetypes, to then do a choice experiment to see how much people would pay for different features of an insurance product. So that would be one way of doing it. It's harder, I mean, again, it's a qualitative thing, so if you're relying on these user interactions and interviews to give you that data, I think it needs to be backed up with a quantitative element, actually, to put a price tag on something. Yeah.
I mean, if I could just jump in, I think that question is relevant, or even more relevant in the sense that it points to the need of combining different approaches if you want to get a more complete understanding of what a wicked problem is and what different measures are needed to solve it. So it could be that service design is not the best approach for answering a willingness to pay question, but rather that you can rely on choice experiments. For instance, but then service design again helps you understand where in the change process willingness to pay is relevant. And what we found, at least in our cookstove work, is that willingness to pay comes in at the beginning, in this before phase that I talked about. But it has very little value once the stove is in someone's home and that person is beginning to sort of dabble with how to use it. Then it's the user manual that matters, or the support service offered by the company that sold it.
Yeah.
Yeah, super. Good. Claudia or Fidra, I'm not sure who came first.
Thanks for presentation. We talked about how service design, what it brings to the research, and so do you think you've contributed to some kind of change among the service design community besides making them figure out there is a whole new market to tap in?
We gave them one.
That's why they went to CEDA a few weeks ago. Yes, definitely. And this is something that sort of on long flights and car journeys and over dinner that we have really interesting conversations about, because many of the service designers we're working with, they feel like they're pushing a boundary in their space as well, that they're doing something that hasn't been done before, and that they know that behavior is important and it comes into everything that they do, and it's like that's what their whole method is about, but they haven't been framing it in that way. So we just recently actually put together a VR proposal to try and bridge these two worlds, the service design research community and the behavioral economics researchers. And that's something, this like research space would be so exciting, I think. And we were really, just enthusiastic about, or surprised by their enthusiasm for this. Like they really pushed us to do this proposal because they want to do more of it and they see a potential for it.
Cool. Can I take the next question? Fidra?
Thank you very much for the presentation, and apologize for being a bit late. I really enjoyed listening to what you've found on the field and how you've helped improve uptake of new technologies. Looking at some of the other initiatives that we have here at SEI, one of them is on sustainable consumption. I was wondering whether there's any scope for this methodology to be used to achieve the reverse, is not the uptake of more, but like less like consumption, or whether the methodology could be adapted to feed into, to test how you can change people's behaviors to buy less or consume more sustainable.
Interesting idea. I like it. Yeah, but I think definitely. I think it's relevant for any transformational behavioral change that you're interested in looking at. Either way.
Yeah, exactly. Understanding why people do what they're doing now. So understanding the current state of affairs, really, and then introducing some sort of change that would elicit a response from them, I think. But definitely. Yeah.
Sorry. Linus, here you go.
So thank you very much. You said that for the cookstoves you had a concrete impact on the retailers or the producers of cookstoves. Did you also measure that? Did you get how much they increased their sales? You could pitch that for donors. And the second one is, I know you worked with Sarah on sanitation a bit, but I'm not updated on if you actually did the whole cycle on uptake on sanitation technologies in any small pilot or so.
No. It's an interesting approach that's been a little tried in the sanitation sector. I think there are some particular challenges because it's a fairly sensitive, private type of technology, I guess you could say. And I think there is a growing interest in sanitation marketing, particularly in urban areas, where this kind of approach could be quite interesting. So I know it's been done a little bit, but not by SEI.
No.
No, I mean the brief answer there is no. We only have the retailers' accounts, like personal accounts of sort of sales going up, and we in no way have the data to say that it can be traced back to the recommendations we provided. I mean, that said, these are companies that we're still in touch with and that still get in touch with us regularly to find out what we're up to and have sort of clearly expressed an interest in continued work. I mean, that said, they don't have the money to pay us to support them, so we would have to find other means of like sustaining such a collaboration. But I think what we really found in terms of just speaking to the sort of relationship that we managed to develop with these stove retailers and also companies working in that, or NGOs working in that space, was that they really felt that we're very like open and accessible partners, in the sense that we didn't come in as experts with sort of clear recommendations for what they should do, but really the findings that we came up with were things that they had told us. We just sort of synthesized it for them, and they being on the one hand the companies, but on the other hand their users. So I think it's this whole, it's extremely co-creative and it's extremely flat and extremely transparent, which makes it a very nice way of engaging also with stakeholders where there may be sort of sensitive issues or things to consider.
Yeah.
Great. Yes.
Just another question. Fiona said something about using it, repurposing it. Can you also repurpose it to evaluate a current way of distributing a product? So if we were to say, hi SEI, we would like you to do a midterm evaluation of our project, could we can then come in and instead of developing, going through the journey to understand, okay, this is how what you've been doing plays into the journey kind of idea. And this is why it's not working, and this is why it is working. So instead of using this as a explorative tool, could you use it as an evaluation tool?
Yes, I think so, definitely. I kind of think that's what the Mango project was.
I was going to say. Well, that was not what it initiated to do, but I think our findings, we could make our findings to be that. I mean, if they would ask us, we could give them a lot of advice on how to better introduce the technologies in that particular study or system.
Exactly. We started with their objectives. What is it that you're trying to do with this intervention? What do you want to achieve? Yeah. And then working back from there, okay, well, you're sort of leaving out quite a lot. And because of that, there's a big mismatch going on at the very local level. So yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the second part of the Ugandan case study now, the quantitative work that you're planning to do, right, on the weather insurance part.
Yeah. Unfortunately, not a huge amount. So what we've done now is basically a sort of lengthier version of what I presented today, obviously, but not a huge write-up of it. Our partners in University of East Anglia, this professor of development economics who's helping us to design, or who is designing the experiment for us, basically asked for key insights that we learned in the qualitative phase. So we presented those to him almost in a dialogue about what you learned and what is it based on, and a lot of questions. And he has then taken this and right now, as we speak, is putting together designing a choice experiment. And we will check in with him next week. He will sort of, hopefully in layman's terms, explain a little bit about how the mechanics of the experiment and where various aspects of our study will be further investigated and tested. And it will be run in June, and we'll have results before the end of the summer.
And do you know how big the sample would be for the experiment?
Yeah, it's relatively. I don't want to put a number. It's several hundreds.
Around.
It's hundreds. Yeah, okay. So it's a representative sample for. I think we're working with a local partner called the Field Lab, and that's a partner of University of East Anglia, and they have access to almost a million inhabitants, sort of in this area that they've been working in for 12 plus years, gathering socioeconomic data and stuff. So you can relatively quickly do these field experiments, and I think the representative data is for 10,000, something like that. Quite, for me it sounded huge, but maybe it's not. I don't know. What do I know?
Yeah. Okay. Any more questions or comments from anyone? Or do you have anything more you want to say?
We'd be really keen to hear if anyone would like to try this in their work, in their projects. And we'd also like, exactly, and if there are a few, if there's a group who's interested, we'd be really keen to look into organizing a workshop or a more in-depth, I don't want to say we can train people, but we can talk about it more as a first step and see what people would like to do in their projects, and if it's required, maybe bring in some more expertise to do some more sort of structured training.
Perhaps it could be good to ask around in the other offices, centers as well, whether they have an interest, because now there's a smaller crowd.
Yeah. We'd also like to look at, well, like we said earlier and at previous presentations, working more directly with donors and partners to see on a sort of more organizational level how we could work with them to get these methods embedded. But yeah, that's for the future.
A couple of more questions.
Well, not so much a question, perhaps more a response to what you just said. Two thoughts that come up in my mind. Well, first of all, of course, that I would be really interested in working with this, but in relation to a policy context rather than technology context. So looking at adaptation, for example, climate change adaptation, policies for that, how can you improve those so that they reach everybody that they're supposed to reach.
Yeah.
Thinking from a social equality aspect as
Yeah.
well. And the other idea or the other thought I get is that maybe this is something that we should ask all of the other or most of the other initiatives. I'm thinking that you could use your tool and apply it on many of the other topics that they work on, and this could be something for an eventual next phase of the initiatives.
Thank you.
Do you have any direct comments on that?
No, I think that's sort of what we had in mind when we talked about this toolbox for the sort of that can be applied to get development interventions, at least some of them work a bit better, that could be something to be used to that effect. But thanks for proposing this, Lisa. We're very humbled by your suggestion.
Great, yeah.
Just a very short comment was a comment on what I actually wanted to say. It would be helpful, yes, to find out if you can apply this for change processes beyond the individual household level. Because that's, I know that we've used this mostly at this level.
Yeah.
The other question is if you can use this also to evaluate business models. So we are doing right now a project on rooftop solar, so off-grid solar. And I think we talked a bit about this. And there, one of the key factors of dealing with the kind of dropout is the payment schedules. So you make people pay. And thereby you're assuming people are still paying for these systems. They probably still want to use it, because if they don't use it, then the systems get remotely switched off and you can't use them anymore. And there are a number of companies, I talked to one today that in Zambia that you know, that does both solar and stoves. So they are now debating, should we maybe use the same kind of switch off, the remote switch off for stoves too, because we can easily do that, it's just a SIM card. So that would be interesting to see how different technologies and different fields kind of converge, how make best use of each other's practices.
Yeah, definitely. The switching off stove thing is happening already. And I think it's, morally questionable whether you should be remotely switching off someone's cook stove. It's not the same thing as a solar home system. That's a whole other discussion. But yeah, definitely. I think just like your other question about evaluation in general, I think yes, for evaluating business models, definitely from the end user's perspective. That's where it came from, service design, to improve business models. So yeah.
Okay. No more questions or comments, I think. Let's thank these ones for presenting today and for this really great discussion. Give them a warm applause.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone who watched online as well.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So many.